Thank you. Welcome. I'm honored today to welcome our guest this evening, award-winning author and professor of English at Syracuse University, George Saunders. George is the author of 9 books, including the New York Times bestsellers, Congratulations, By the Way, and 10th of December. Also an essay collection, The Brain-Dead Megaphone. And the critically acclaimed collections, Civil War Land in Bad Decline, Pastoralia, and In Persuasion Nation. His work has appeared in the New Yorker, Harper's, and GQ. I found out that George has actually always been interested in reading ever since 3rd grade because he had a nun for a teacher who he was secretly in love with. And she convinced him to read and turned him on to a book that he really enjoyed. And so since that time, it's been nothing but good things with George. Since 1996, George has taught MFA students at Syracuse University, which he considers a great privilege. He is a recipient of multiple awards, including the National Magazine Award for Fiction in 1994, 1996, 2000, and 2004, a Guggenheim Fellowship and MacArthur Fellowship recipient in 2006, and many more. Tonight, George will talk about his novel, Lincoln in the Bardo, which recently won the prestigious 2017 Man Booker Prize. Described as unique, surreal, and experimental, this book is about Abraham Lincoln and the death of his 11-year-old son, Willie, in 1862. Please join me in welcoming to Dominican University our honored guest, George Saunders.
Hi there, thank you so much for coming out. This campus is so beautiful. I want to be 18 again and come here. The last couple of years I've had this shtick where I said, well, when you get to a certain age, your sense of smell goes away. I just was in the wrong place. So thank you for having me. This is the first day of a 15-city tour, so you're the only people who will actually see me fresh. So this is as fresh as I get. So I thought I would talk a little bit about Lincoln and also maybe just kind of a talk about the writing process. I think that's really the only thing I have come to understand in my life is the strange route by which a story can be written. This book was publicized as my first novel, but actually many years ago, my wife and I, we got engaged in 3 weeks in the romantic Syracuse, New York ambiance. And we had our first daughter almost immediately, and my wife was stuck in bed for 5 months of the pregnancy. And then the second daughter came the same way. So by the time we'd known each other, something like 3.5 years, she'd been in bed on bed rest for 10 months, and we'd only known each other that short time. And we were broke on top of everything else. So in this period, I kept thinking, I know I meant to do something good in my life, and but I was working as a tech writer, and we had our babies at home. And during that period of kind of, quiet desperation, maybe not that quiet, a friend of mine got married in Mexico. So we pulled the money together, and I went by myself to this wedding, and it was the young writer's dream. It was a beautiful location. It was officiated by a radical Catholic priest. There was a male model / surfer in the wedding party, right next to a guy who just gotten out of Joliet State Prison, so it was everything you could ask for. So I came home, and I swear to you, I said this to my wife. I said, honey, you're sitting on a gold mine. Just give me a little room, So she did. And so I was working a tech writing job full-time. And so I would come home from the job, help with the kids, try to have a sane family life. And then when she went to bed, I would drink this magical combination of a pot of coffee and a bottle of Boone's Farm. Does that ring any bells? Yeah. That wasn't every day, but every 4th day, But I was writing every night on this schedule. So at the end of this year, I had this 700-page Joycean tome And I thought, no, I'm a part of the Raymond Carver lineage. I'm a minimalist. I'll cut it down. So I cut it to 360 over another 6 months. And at the end of this, I said to my wife, I think this is it. Our poverty is over. Yeah. So I know from the event beforehand, there were some writers in the crowd. So this feeling where you say, if you want to read it, you could. It's fine. Just take your time, no rush at all. And then you perch outside the door like, what's going on? So I did that, and my wife is reading this book, and I peeked in, and honestly, she must have been on page 4. And this is what she was doing. Because she knew what that had cost our family, So that was my first novel. And just so you know how good it was, the title was La Boda de Eduardo, which I think it means like Ed's wedding or something like that. But anyway, that was the beginning of a process of changing the way that I wrote. So let me just kind of, I always hesitate at this part because what I'm about to tell you is so simple and kind of dumb that I feel, a little bit shamed by it. But here's the actual truth of the writing process for me. And I like to be honest about it because when I was a young writer, people would come and they'd talk about their books. And they'd always say, someone would say, well, tell us how you wrote the book. And you'd say, well, I wanted to do something about patriarchy. And so I thought also the hawking culture in the 15th century in Italy. And I wanted to use a palette of reds and blues too. I'm like, really? Is that how you really do it? Because I'm dead. I have to get a different job. So I want to be honest. And here's the way my writing life goes. I've written something, somehow or another there's 4 or 5 or 10 pages over here. When I come into the room, there's a little dance, which is, oh God, I'm about to write. If I screw it up, I'm a fraud. Let's play the guitar a little bit. Play guitar. And the papers are over there. I set them out strategically the day before. And at one point you're playing and you just look over. Those stories are still over there. Then you might put the guitar down and just kind of sit in that vicinity of the room. Oh yeah. And then you might scoot your chair up. You're still not writing. You're just sitting in a chair. And then the fateful moment for me is when I can get my eyes to fall on the first line of text. And as a language person, that's catnip, I can pick up the phone book and start editing it, So then I just grab a pen and I just start editing what I've written already. Now that right in there is, in truth, that's the crux of the matter is you read a sentence and you react to it. Now, what part of your mind is reacting to it? When I was younger, it was always an intellectual part or an imitative part. Sometimes a scheming part. How can I trick the reader? Now, the way I think of it is that this is kind of a model, but it's basically true. There's a meter in my head, and over here it says P for positive, and this says N for negative. And as I'm reading, I'm kind of reading as if I had never seen it before, and I'm trying to keep an eye on that meter. Now, if you go into a bookstore and pick up a book, you'll see that meter is operative for all of us, It's a thing that makes you either buy the book or put it down, or makes you realize you've been standing in the bookstore for 15 minutes reading something. So for me, the whole game is watch that meter. If it stays up in the positive, you're good. Just start spending the money, no problem. But when that needle starts to drop, that's the critical moment. Because when you're maybe a younger or more insecure writer, the first thing you do when the meter drops is you go into denial mode. It's fine. It's about patriarchy. It can be a little boring, But if you're a more mature writer, the needle drops and you say, all right. Almost like it's with your kid, You say, little book, what's the problem? Why did your needle drop? And the book will say, no, it didn't. It's fine. You say, no, come on. You can talk to me. I'm your creator. Come on. And if you kind of just, turn to yourself in that gentle mode, at some point you'll answer yourself. The book will answer you, and it'll say, well, I'm boring. You're like, oh, you are boring. I know, it's okay. Where are you boring? Page 4. Yes. Where on page 4? It's that 8th line. But, so of course I'm hamming it up a bit, but the truth is there is that moment where you feel your energy dropping. You don't actually have to know the reason, I don't think. I think in some ways that's an obstruction when the energy drops and you try to label it. because the labeling of it actually isn't going to help you solve it. So I think if I've learned any skill in these 300 years I've been writing, it's just the intuitive move of translating the drop in the energy to an edit. Sometimes it's as simple as you're sort of repeating yourself. The cat walked across the black table, the ebony surface, the dark expanse. Now that's okay, but for me, I would rather just have it be the black table. So these micro edits are actually the way I think that the energy gets made. So this kind of leads to another idea, which is that I think we're taught in school that writing is about theme. What's the theme of Romeo and Juliet? Difficult love, or what, I don't know what it is. But that's not why we read it. There are probably 1 million books on the same theme as Romeo and Juliet that no one can read. So the point is actually, I think, the line-to-line progress through the book, the way that your brain sort of expands in that zone. And I think, from my point of view as a writer, what I found is that has very, very much to do with me not being too sure of what I'm doing. Donald Barthelme said, the writer is that person who, embarking on her task, has no idea how to proceed. And Gerald Stern, I think, are there kids here? They wouldn't admit it anyway. But Gerald Stern, the poet, said, if you start out to write a poem about two dogs fucking, and you write a poem about two dogs fucking, then you wrote a poem about two dogs fucking. Think about it. But not too much. But then Einstein said it, of course, smarty pants. He said it even better. He said, no worthy problem is ever solved in the plane of its original conception. So this means we start to write a story, and of course the insecurity immediately hits us. I hope my ending is good. I hope this story has some kind of heft or some kind of meaning. Paradoxically, if at that point you decide what the meaning is and then force it into the story, you will write a story that has no energy. So the whole craft, strangely, is to, through technical means that you will devise that have a lot to do with your natural mode of expression, you will write yourself into a Houdini-like trap from which it seems you can't possibly escape. When you do that, again, your first impulse is to say, this book is a Rubik's Cube I can't solve. But the more mature impulse is to say, thank you, gods of art, because now, as was the case with Houdini, if you can do it, it's going to be great. It's going to be wonderful. The reader knows that you've written yourself into that entanglement and is looking at you with some trust and some hope that you'll be able to get out of it together. So that's kind of the game. The opposite of that, when you over-control your material, is the equivalent of kind of pulling your big manure truck of ideas and concepts up to the reader and going, just sit there. Wow, So it's a little bit like being on a bad date. And I haven't been on one since the Civil War era, but the idea that when you meet someone who isn't really relating to you, they are using you to project onto. They're lecturing to you, they're mansplaining to you. They are basically using you as a vehicle to show how smart they are. No, that's not very much fun. The tendency for us writers is to do that because it's so scary to do the other thing, as it is in life, to have a sincerely open, hopefully intimate communication with another person that you regard as being as intelligent, worldly, and wonderful as you are. But the bad story is a bit like the date where the one person brings index cards. Tell me about your mother. It's a little bit okay for the person with the index cards because he doesn't have the anxiety of feeling out of control. But for the recipient, it's not so great. So this is kind of the basic idea of it. It's a lot of fun, but it's also a little scary. And for somebody like me, who's been doing this a long time, it means that every time you go to your writer's table, you have to almost disavow mastery. It's not like I used to be an engineer. In engineering, you're presented with a problem and there are 3 solutions. you choose the best one. Writing is a much more frightening sort of leap off the cliff kind of a feeling. But here's why I love it. In that mode of not knowing, in the words of this great Chicago writer, Stuart Dybek, the story actually starts talking to you. It kind of tells you what it wants you to do. Not in any mystical way, but I don't know if I can explain this, but as you're editing to taste. Now for me, that has something to do with the sound of language, and I know writers work in all different modes. But as you're editing to taste, the story actually starts to morph under your hand. It starts to change, and it's not you doing it. Or it's a better part of you doing it. So for me, the great beauty of this thing is at 59, I'm kind of sick of this guy, actually. He's been with me a long time. And he keeps having the same neuroses and the same thoughts and the same, crazy egotistical ideas, the same anxieties. In that mode of writing, when you write yourself into uncertainty, what I found is that guy is sort of ushered out of the room. And what's left is this thing, and I think most of us know it maybe through religion, through meditation or prayer. I've had an encounter with that alternate person after someone I loved has died, that kind of open, raw, non-conceptual person you become. So for me, it's very wonderful to have a place where I can go and enact some sustained positive concentration and get me off my back in a certain way. But as I said, a lot of this is done by not lofty thoughts, but by small, almost trivial edits. So I'll give you kind of a cartoon example. This is a bit silly in its extreme, but it's not so far off. If I started with a sentence like, one day Bob came into the room and sat down on the blue couch. That's okay. It's an English sentence. It's functional. But now this is my taste starts to operate in that sentence. And what I think is there's something banal about this sentence. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't feel like me. It doesn't feel like the sentence has any actual personality. So then, because of this nun connection that Russ mentioned, I have a very active inner nun who walks around with a big red pen all the time. So in this situation, she'll say, okay, one day Bob came into the room and sat down on the blue couch. She says, Mr. Saunders, do we need to say one day? Isn't that implied? Yes, sister, it is. All right, so we cut that. Bob came into the room and sat down on the blue couch. Better. But actually, he doesn't have to come into the room, because if he sits on the couch, it's implied he's already in the room. Good point. Bob sat down on the blue couch. Kind of Hemingway-esque, But then we think, well, why does he have to sit down on the blue couch? All right. Bob sat on the blue couch. That's getting pretty good. Well, if I do say so myself. But then now the way my mind works, and here, this is, I'm not claiming that these cuts are reasonable, but when you're a writer, you're trying to find the place where your taste is so strong that you start making unreasonable demands on the text. So for me, I think blue, why do I care what color the stupid couch is? It has no meaning. It's just a throwaway. Okay. Bob sat on the couch. All right. Now, this is, again, the excessive part of me says, so what? I don't care if he sat on the couch. What's he going to say? So I would just cut it. And we're down to Bob. But we don't suck yet. So in a way, of course, this exaggerated, but that is kind of the process. And the magical thing is I start doing that, and slowly the story tells me what it wants to be. Sometimes it's a matter of just straightening out a little logic, making sure that the thing actually makes sense. Sometimes it's avoiding repetition. Sometimes it's just saying, if I cut this phrase, the reader will probably supply the correct idea, and we gain a little bit of efficiency in exchange for maybe 10% less certainty, that kind of algebraic thing. And at the base of this idea is something that I've discovered a few years ago that really has kind of jumped out of my writing life into my actual life, and it's this principle. Mostly when we start telling a story, if I said, everybody stand up and tell a story, you'll notice there's three presences. There's a reader, there's a writer, and there's a character. Most of us habitually, when we start to tell a story, will have the character beneath us, also will have the reader beneath us. Most of us, I think, have us, the reader, and the character down here, especially in comic fiction. The character gets stepped on a lot. I think, again, I can't defend it or explain it, but in my experience, the revision process does a beautiful thing. The first thing it does is it brings the reader up to my level. When I say the cat walked across the black table, the ebony surface, the dark expanse, I think at a micro level, when you get to that second phrase, you kind of think I think less of you, slightly. You know, the black table is sufficient. When I say Frank moved to Pittsburgh, a city in Pennsylvania, you know, it's just a very small difference in the way I perceive you if I add that phrase. So the real thing is, as I said earlier, I'm trying to write this story to me if I hadn't read it a million times already. Which is to say, I want to give you, my reader, credit for every bit of worldly experience and good intention and a loving heart and experience and reading ability that I would give myself. If you can do that, what happens is we get on the same level. And I'm writing out of this intuitive place. And doing that, as I said earlier, I become this kind of better guy. Almost, I'm a Buddhist, so I would say one's Buddha nature gets a little bit purified and present. Meanwhile, you're reading, and if I'm doing my job, that's happening to you as well. And we've all felt that. You're coming out, and the two of us get up in that rarefied air and kind of like fish jumping out of water, we kiss. I don't think fish actually do that, but I like the image. But we get into this kind of moment of communion that's quite unusual relative to what we might be able to manage out in the hallway there. At the same time, what happens is, as you're revising text to make it more intelligent and more efficient and so on, the character also kind of comes up. So the silly example I use for this is, if I said, you know, in my next novel, I said Frank was an asshole. That's the first sentence. Okay, it's a sentence, but something about it isn't satisfying. And I think what's dissatisfying about that sentence is it's mere assertion and it's vague. So the gods of fiction say, you say Frank is an asshole, and the gods of fiction say, how so? And you go, oh, all right. Frank was an asshole because he snapped at the barista. And then something tells you, snapped at the young barista is better. Then we suddenly find that we don't have to say the asshole, because that's a yucky word anyway. Frank snapped at the young barista. It's a better sentence. It's active. But the gods of fiction say, why do you think he did that? And again, there's that magic moment where you blurt out the answer, so to speak. Frank snapped at the young barista who reminded him of his wife, dead wife. And suddenly this guy Frank went from way down here, you know, an asshole for reasons I can't tell you, to a guy who was so capable of loving that when he loses his beloved, he can't behave like a decent person to a teenager. Now, I didn't do that because I wanted to write about grief or loss or Frank or coffee. I did it in the service of making that sentence a little more lively. That's the only reason. And the mystery is when you do that, all those other things happen. So in the perfect story, I think, you get a kind of troika of empathy where reader, writer, and character are all together. The character is coming out of my mind and out of your mind. And the character is someone, even if the character is not a good character, we've sort of dignified him or her with our attention, i.e. With our love. So that for me is kind of the model of it. Now it doesn't go smoothly usually. And if you'd talked to me 3 days ago, I would have just been in my pajamas in my room very grouchy because it wasn't going well. But so this process for me, I first discovered it right after that Mexican novel, actually, because I had this big disappointment, and I went into work the next week, and my wife, you know, we've been married a long time, and she really knows my work, and her response is either to tear up or to kind of go, yeah. So I know if she says, yeah, then I have to go back and work. And then that Mexican novel, I don't think I even got that. I should just, So I went into work as a tech writer the next week, and I was working at an environmental company, and I was charged with taking notes on a conference call. So I was depressed about this book, and the conference call was really boring, and I didn't need to be there. So I found myself writing these little Seussian poems, kind of Seussian doggerel, just da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. And they were a little naughty, a little funny. And whenever I'd finish one, I just draw a little cartoon over on the side. And I wasn't even thinking about it. I was listening to the call. And when I got done, there was about 20 pages of these kind of silly poems. And I just almost threw them away, and I thought, I kind of like them. So I brought them home and threw them on the table and went off to do something with the kids. And I heard from the other room this precious sound of my wife laughing. It was like the first pleasurable reaction she'd had to my work in many years, And not only her, if you're a writer, you know this. So someone will say to you, oh, I read your story. Oh, or maybe the second thing is, I read your work. It's interesting. Nobody wants to be interesting. But she had this genuine reaction. So what I realized in that moment was all these years of this long apprenticeship, which at that point was about 7 years worth, because I'm from a working class background, and I didn't go to school for English. I went to school for geophysical engineering. So I have a bit of a self-esteem problem around literature, actually. I had been sort of suppressing certain things in my personality. So as you can tell, I talk fast, you might have noticed. My dad was a salesman in Chicago, working class, very happy with scatological humor. Whenever I get nervous, I try to be funny. It's just a reflex. I have a first girlfriend, and she said, you're never serious with me, so I think I'm going to break up with you because you're always making a joke. And I made a joke, just like that. But all of those things that I used to get through my actual life, because I was so intimidated to be in the house of literature, I was keeping off the table. So it felt to me a little bit like if you were in an alley getting totally beat up, and you look down and they were like this tall. These little kids are beating you up. And then you recognize that you have both your hands behind your back, So after that conference call, it was like I took my hands out from behind my back and I said, all right, I'm going to be funny if I can. I'm going to write about pop culture. I'm going to write about what's actually happening in my life, which was, to put it in Terry Eagleton's phrase, capitalism was plundering the sensuality of my body, And this all came out in this instinctive feeling that maybe part of writing was actually to be entertaining. And so I tell my students at Syracuse, it's not always linear, but often the person that you are under duress, or in love, or when you're trying to talk your way out of a jam, or when you're trying to offer consolation to somebody, it would be weird if that person, if that voice and that presence didn't have some place in your work. To write 300 pages is a lot of work. And you actually can't fake it for 300 pages. Now, you can use a lot of white space, as I did in this book. That works. But seriously, this is one of my things. So in that moment, I'll just conclude with this. It was such a bittersweet moment. I came back to work, and I wrote a very crazy, funny piece that got accepted for publication right away. And it ended up being the first story in my first book, or the first story I'd finished in my first book. And I wrote it with incredible certainty and fun, and at every point, I knew what the right decision was. It was just a totally different feeling relative to the one I'd been having for 7 or 8 years. But when I finished it, there was a kind of a feeling of disappointment, because I loved, for example, Hemingway, loved Chekhov, loved the Russian writer Isaac Babel. And when I compared this story to those stories, I just felt like, oh, is that it? Almost like if my talent was a hunting dog, I said, go get it, boy, go get me a story. And the dog raced off and came back with like the lower half of a Barbie doll or something. You're like, that's it? But at the same time, it was here the metaphor goes bad, but it was my Barbie doll or something like that. So the way I tell it to my students is it was almost like all those years, there'd been Hemingway Mountain over here. And I'd been like, Ernest, I love you. I'm coming to see you and join you as your partner. Your 20th century, your late 20th century student, basically. So all those years I did it. But then you get up there and you see that Ernie is standing on a little 6-foot platform. And no matter how hard you try, you're going to be at his armpits, you know. And so you're up there and you think, well, why was I so interested in Hemingway? He was an upper-class kid, a doctor's son. I'm a working-class guy. I should do something more authentic. Forget it, Ernie. And you know, slog down Hemingway Mountain. I'm never going to imitate anybody. Oh, Kerouac Mountain. There's a working-class guy. And you trudge up that mountain. Rinse, lather, repeat. You know, James Joyce, whoever. Then when I wrote this little story that I mentioned, it was almost like then I looked over and there was a little shit hill with like a handmade sign, Saunders. So, but the wisdom and the beauty of that moment is that you go stand on the shit hill because you've already been an interloper on everybody else's hill. So you stand there and you just say, please rise, you know, please little shit hill, please grow. So that's about all I would say. Maybe one more thought. This way of writing leads you to a certain conclusion, which is that I think a story writer or a novelist, say a story writer, is not supposed to know what a story is, actually. For me, even after all these years of slaving away at it, I just think of a story. There's two things that help me. One is to imagine it as a roller coaster ride. So at the end of my story, I want you to be breathless and stunned and like, wow, I don't know if I like that or not, but maybe willing to go on again. I don't want you to say interesting. I don't want you to say, oh, the metaphysics of this story are quite exquisite. I don't mind if you say that a couple minutes later, but I think the first effect should be kind of a intense enlivening. You know, suddenly the world is there for you again, and you don't know why. Another way to say this is I think of it as being like, I'm going to construct a black box up here, show you in. You're going to come out the other side in a different state than you were when you went in. And the effects should be non-trivial, somehow meaningful, and very powerful. Now, for what I found is that for me to do that to you, I can't know what's going to happen in there, except by the means I've described. To construct it inside to taste, then you'll be ejected with power on the other side. So for me, it's been a beautiful way to live life, because essentially what it does is it reminds you day in and day out that you are not just this everyday person, that there's a mental space you can get into that is quite in touch with God or Buddha or whatever you want to call it. And if nothing else, going into your writing room every day reminds you of just that reality. Even if you can't get there, it reminds you of it as a possibility. So thank you very much. And I think I can take questions if you'd like. I'd be happy to do that.
Would you mind sharing something about your process with including all the citations and Lincoln and the Bardo in the body of the novel?
Sure, yes. The Lincoln, I didn't talk about the Lincoln much, sorry. I'm so sick of it. No, so what happened basically was, okay, so there was a story that Lincoln had held his son's body in the crypt, which I heard 20 years ago, and I just couldn't forget about it, and I couldn't figure out exactly how to approach it. So one day I was trying to think of it, and you think, okay, so Lincoln's in the graveyard alone at night. Who narrates? You could have Lincoln, 7 ago. So then that doesn't work. And then you think, well, who else would be in a graveyard at night? A gravedigger? Practicing? Doesn't make sense, That's a good one. So then I just thought, ghosts. Ghosts would be in the graveyard. And I sort of stumbled into this place where I could imagine Lincoln in the graveyard and a chorus of ghosts that we know already narrating his night, so that seemed good. So I started writing that, and it was going pretty well, except that needle in my head at a certain page would always drop. And I think what it was telling me was that ghosts are kind of, they can be whatever you want them to be. And the reader starts to feel that. There's a sort of a high level of whimsicality. They're in some ways, they're analogous to a dream sequence. You can do whatever you want. My teacher, Tobias Wolff, one time said to me after reading one of my stories, he said, George, in a writing career, you're allowed 3 dream sequences. So don't use them up, So I started to feel that the book was too much, too many ghosts all the time, and an intelligent reader that I'm trying to respect would sort of observe me having too much quasi-masturbatory fun over here with the ghosts. So it needed a little bit of a factual spine. And at the same time, I knew a lot of things about the historical truth of it that were really beautiful, and that were really heartbreaking. So I just thought, well, how do I get the history in? And I went through about a month of trying to write this kind of Gore Vidal-esque third-person narration. It just didn't have any fun. So I did a little neurotic back and forth Q&A with myself. How do you know the history? Well, I read it in history books. Why don't you just put those in? Can I do that? It's your book, idiot. So then, there's that artistic moment where what was forbidden or seemed impossible suddenly becomes a challenge that's built in, which then is the gateway to possible virtuosity. If you do it with enough panache, the reader has this double reaction, which is, you can't, oh, you did. So I had one scene where there's a really sad thing. Willie Lincoln and his brother had typhoid, and they were sick upstairs in the White House, and there was a party that had been planned, and there was some talk of canceling it. A doctor said, you don't need to do that. They had this big brawl in the White House, and that was the night that Willie took a turn for the worse and went downhill and died. So, as a parent, that's a huge thing. So I'm narrating that party using all of these historical tidbits. And at first I'm kind of like, this isn't writing, really. And then one day I hit the golden arrangement of these things, and it really came alive. And I thought, oh, so writing actually can be curation. It can be. Then at one point there was a moment where I had a vision of something that happened at the party, but I couldn't find a quote. So I thought, hey, wait a minute, it's a novel. So I just made it up. And so that became the pattern of the book, is there's a bunch of historical quotes, some of which are true and some of which are invented. And this was all before fake news became a thing, so it's kind of, just... I don't know who's...
So George, I got my hardbound copy of Lincoln at a used paperback bookstore in Sonoma County. Mm-hmm. It looked like it hadn't even been opened. I took it home. I got through 15, 20, 25 pages, and I went, what the heck? Tossed it aside. Then thought about it that night, thought about it, and went back and started over again. And pretty soon was caught up in the absolute mind-blowing thing that you did in this book.
Oh, thank you.
Which is absolutely phenomenal. So I told my husband, you have to read this book.
Thank you. I'm glad it turned out that way.
Well, he took the book, he started reading it, I heard him say, what the heck, and the book got tossed. Then he read it, and he said it was amazing. So I just wanted to say to you, wow. Wow.
Thank you. I'll accept that. No, but it's a really interesting thing. Last year, this time, it was a hardcover tour, and I did 30 cities in 32 days. Which it's really fun. What happens though is you start to really it's an incredible privilege. But what you start to hear is you hear that is not, you're not the only person. That's a really familiar pattern that people get to page 15 or 20, and it either the light goes on or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, people really get pissed off. I had a Facebook message. This guy said, and I don't know, he's being clever. He said, if I compared your book to a pile of shit, your book would come in second. I'm like. What? On Facebook. So I wrote back, I said, oh, you didn't like it? But it's actually really interesting because for me, this book was, I'd written, I think 8 other books before this. And I was starting to get the hang of it, I'm a satirist, dystopian, sci-fi, funny, blah, 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 blah. Very addicted to contemporary voice and humor in that mode and all these things. And, you have a certain career and you hear this about yourself and you start to believe it and it solidifies. And it solidifies partly anchored by the fear I talked about earlier, that the ability to write could leave in an instant. So it's one of the dangers of being an older or, whatever, mid-career writer is that you start to cling to the side of the pool, If your brain is a sphincter, it kind of like shrinks, The only band in the world is Foghat, So you become addicted to your methods. This book, I'd had the idea for 20 years, as I said, and I got to a place after 10th of December was done, and it was starting to look like it would be successful. And I just had this thought, like, all right, so if you died right now, you did okay, you know. If you don't try this book, you're going to start to shrink. Even though the book has more earnestness than you feel like you can manage, and it might be schmaltzy or sentimental easily, if you don't try it, you know, your gravestone is going to say, failed to attempt that which he most wanted to do, which is not so good. So I took a leap, and one of the things that I struggled with so much, as you're pointing out, is for me to tell this story in a way that wasn't banal, you know. Lincoln came into the frosty graveyard in a sad frame of mind. I had to come up with a different form to tell it. That form was risky. And when I was done, I thought, okay, I'm making a sort of a weird gate for someone to come through in those first 30 pages. I think most of the people that will love the book will either make it through or in several attempts make it through. The book will teach you how to read it, and then the gamble was that in the last third there'd be an incredible payoff because of the efficiency allowed you by the weird form, you know. So, but it's funny, you know, people, when you travel with the book or when you get reviews, sometimes people assume that the writer is 100% behind his book, you know, and he's pulling a fast one or something like that. But in truth, if you spent 4 years with the book, you know its defects so much better than anybody else. And craft is really kind of the papering over of the mistakes and the errors and the falsities that are built into the concept. So it's not really a big surprise to you when someone says this or that. So I think an artist is much more vulnerable and unsure than maybe a critic would sometimes think, you know. Anyway, but thank you I'm glad it worked.
Hi. Can you talk a moment about the concept of the Bardo and if you have to believe in it to write your book?
Thank you. Well, the Bardo, my wife and I are Buddhists, and I'm kind of, unfortunately, a bit of, an amateur. I believe in it, but I'm a little, maybe my ambition takes me away from it. But the Bardo in the Tibetan tradition just means transitional zone. So we're in one now. We're in the Bardo between birth and death. And then the one that people often talk about is the one between death and the next thing. So in a way, I just love the idea of it. And we were meditating a lot while I was writing this book, and it seemed to me, I think it's true. I think, I don't think the mind ends at death. And I think there are experiences after death, and they're not like this experience. Except they use the same basic fruit. In other words, if you're a jealous, stingy person now, the Tibetan texts tell us, you're going to be that times 1,000,000 in that zone. Yeah. So, but if you're a generous, loving person, then that, I'm probably not getting the details quite right. But, and in fact, what happened was I set out to write a book that would be totally faithful to the Tibetan texts. And at some point, the book says to you, I'm a novel. My job is not to be accurate or a catalog, it's to thrill a reader in this magical way. So in the end, I thought, well, they're kind of in purgatory, but the Catholic version of purgatory that I was taught was kind of static. You go to something like the DMV and you sit on a hard bench until the end of days, But this state is more like we see in some of the Tibetan texts, where you bring your habit energy into it, and then if you can recognize that it's your mind making that habit energy, you can be liberated, So for me, that was one idea, and the other one was the idea from the Gnostic Gospel, which Jesus says, if you bring forth that which is within you, that which you bring forth will save you. If you fail to bring forth that which is within you, that which you fail to bring forth will destroy you. So that's kind of so I don't know if you have to believe it, but I'm starting to think that one of the things that makes a good writer is that she does believe the fictive reality 100%. And that's manifested by her making sure that all the details are right and that it's full of specificity. We just read our admissions documents for the Syracuse program. We got 650 applications for 6 places. Yeah, and it's just an unbelievable display of talent. And but what you see is that I think actually the writers that we chose are ones who when they were in the zone, they really believed that what they were making mattered and that it was real to them. We used to take our students to New York, and they get to meet agents and editors. And there was this wonderful agent named Mort Janklow, and he tells this story. He had a writer who was kind of a serious literary writer who never made any money. Maybe that's redundant. But this guy, and one of Mort's other clients was Danielle Steele. And this guy watched Danielle Steele over the years and finally said, you know, Mort, I'm going to write a Danielle Steele book. I'm going to cash in. And Mort said, good luck with that. And the guy went off for 2 or 3 years, and he called so frustrated. And he said, well, I can't do it. And Mort said, of course you can't do it. You don't believe in it. And he said that Danielle Steele had one time called Mort at 2 a.m. in tears. Edgar is dead. And he's like, Edgar? Who's Edgar? Is that her husband? You know, Edgar was a character in the book. You know, so I think this is these. You have to. There's something a reader knows if you don't really believe in the reality that you're describing.
So I think it's more of an appreciation, trying to be a question, but I was blown away by this book, and had a very strong reaction to it. That I had to check with a friend of mine who's a better reader, and we both came away with this sort of uncannily strong feeling that of Joyce and of the Circe chapter of Ulysses, and the kind of human relief and dignity that perhaps one of the greatest novels ever written produces. So.
Yeah.
I think I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you.
And you did mention Joyce a couple of times on the way in to your talk. So,
well, one of the fun things about this book was because I couldn't use contemporary diction, I had a kind of a permission slip to do older dictions. So I thought, okay, so this is 1862. Whitman isn't known yet. Joyce isn't known yet. But if you're in the afterlife, you're getting a hint of Whitman and Joyce because those are such superhuman languages. So you could kind of give yourself a hall pass to do modernism again a little bit. And one of the challenges of this book is we did an audiobook, and there's 166 different voices in this book, which we know because we got a different person to cover each one. And we got Susan Sarandon and Ben Stiller, my mom, my dad, But when you're trying to distinguish 166 voices, you have to use every trick, So sometimes to invoke Joyce, sometimes to invoke Hemingway, sometimes to even invoke Kerouac to kind of give the characters a little difference. But thank you very much for that reaction. I hope you're right. Oh, sure. I don't know. Should we take one more maybe?
Want to take one more question?
Sure. Yes. I don't want to be a cameo. No, I don't. No, we did sell it, and we're trying to figure it out. But I sold it to Nick Offerman and Megan Mullally, who are friends of mine, and we have a solemn pact that if we can't make the movie as weird as the book, like you think of the historical material, okay, that's a nice idea. The weird book that came out of it, we want to do that at least as much for the movie. So I hope it will happen. There was not to be like a salesman, but why not? The New York Times put on their website a beautiful virtual reality film made by this director named Graham Sachs, which you can get the headsets, and you're there at the graveyard, and Lincoln walks by you, and it's kind of a beautiful experience. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it so very much.